right, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to everybody who's also joining us online. My name is Sara Berger, and I am the director of the Notre Dame-IBM Technology Ethics Lab, and it's really my pleasure and honor to be moderating this session today on building an equitable era of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs for short. I know we've all been learning a lot about all the different innovations in AI, quantum computing, longevity, but I think it's of no surprise that along with and often in connection to these technological advancements, we're also seeing advancements in neurotechnologies. And that could be anything from restoring speech, regaining movement after paralysis, even augmenting memory, and just even expanding our knowledge about the brain. But of course, right, we have these really critical questions, which is who gets access to these benefits and who decides? And how do we, as individuals, but also as people with very distinct expertise in this room, how do we ensure that neuro innovations benefit everybody, especially people that need them, and then also not only the select few? And how do we also, as we're doing this, build trust in not only devices and the ecosystems, but at the same time, really protect human agency, autonomy, and dignity? And these are not easy questions. GESDA has been working on this since 2021, all the way from talking about neuro rights and agency and augmentation to where we find ourselves today, where we're thinking not only about what a future equitable neurotech ecosystem looks like, but also what that requires of all of us. So before starting with a panel discussion, I'm going to actually turn it over to Dr. Patrick Aebischer, who's going to really set the stage for us, give us some context as to what is the state of the art for brain-computer interfaces, what are the questions and opportunities moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Let me say, I'm here for two reasons. One, I'm the vice chair of GESDA, and GESDA has been looking at this subject for quite some time. And I think it's mature enough that we're ready to engage. You've heard about the OQI, but to do something, what we call a translation or impact forum, and choose BCI as one of them. And the second thing, I'm a neuroscientist myself, so that's why I'm passionate about this area. So what we could say is now, this field has moved quite a bit. We've had it in the radar. We're not going into the detail, but the BCI, or say the whole neurotechnology has been, but we've seen this acceleration that justify probably that something more should be done. And you can see this by this massive increase in activity in the last 10 years. To some extent, when you look at the radar, we were not, we were a bit slow. The technology went faster than we thought, and you can see the number of companies, but also the number of policy, standard regulatory activities, and newcomers, certainly companies, and people have heard a lot about Neuralink and Elon Musk interest in this field. Onward, INBRAIN is present here today, but also something quite new but very telling is China unveils a 17-step national plan in brain computing interface. And that's why it's exciting. Now, why has this happened? For two reasons. One is the technology allows you to acquire more data, and both from electrophysiology but optical measurement on one side, and there's an explosion there, but also the understanding of the circuitry, the capacity to analyze, and let's say the AI now having an impact on trying to understand this amount of data so as to make something useful out of it, and one of them being the targeted BCI. Now, we've known this is not something that was coming from yesterday. It is already a clinical practice for tremor, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, what we call deep brain stimulation, when you put electrodes in people's brain and stimulate those areas. Now, those are not really scalable. So, for example, there's about 150,000 people in the world that benefit from them, but this is very time-consuming. Those can be done only in a very few places, and they're very expensive. But now it's not only in reading in the brain and writing in the brain, you can also read more and more. And this is very interesting, as was said, in speech, for example, for locked-in syndrome. But this technological improvement could go beyond medical application. And that's why GESDA think that something needs to be done. Also, to frame it, you can look at those technologies from a cognitive enhancement, from brain-to-brain interface, and even down the road, maybe collective synchrony. And that's what the radar tells us. So what are the present challenges? A lot of those things, as I said, are invasive because you implant electrode arrays in people's brain. And that you cannot do everywhere. It has to be done very carefully. And there are only a few places. The second thing is in situ data analysis. Typically, you record the data, you process them outside the brain, and you re-inject them because the heat propagation generation is too much for the brain to hold inside. So it is a bit cumbersome, you could say. And the last thing is, if you go down to non-medical application, I think in human augmentation, we absolutely need a frame to try to develop those technologies. Now, 2 words on the trade-off. To some extent, we've learned a lot by putting electrode arrays, first in non-human primates and non-primates. Very few, but that generates gigantic and extremely important information. From an intraparenchymal in the brain, we go on top of the brain, what we call a brain surface electrode, ECOGs, and that's less invasive. But today, you can start to get a lot of data from what we call subcutaneous, just under the skin of your skull, and maybe down the road, you can have sufficient information that you can have just wearable helmets, for example. And those, of course, change entirely the scalability. Now, the data is not sufficient, but what is happening at the data processing is changing the game. And you can say, I will not go into the detail, but some of the hardware breakthroughs that you can see, low power system on chips, that have in situ processing, that allow low latency and so on. And the second thing is also flexible electrodes that are more adaptable. And on the software side, the GPT technologies that allows it, and with the self-supervised model training, you can start to train those data, and then you can probably go less invasive. It is very conceivable that a sub-Q could do maybe soon, 5, 10 years, don't know, as much as an implantable electrodes. So I think what we have the impression, this will be scalable. And that's why it is so important to now try to think and frame this work. So again, you want to make it accessible to a large amount of people. And the second thing, you want to be sure that it's safe and that it's properly used, specifically for beyond medical application. Just 2 words about the next 5 years, for example, how fast China will be able to translate the 17-point plan to procurement, pilots, and reimbursement. They put a 2030 target, so you could see we're not talking about a very long time there. How fast will this ISO SEC 43 move from recommendation to fundamental standards? Are we going to have brain standards? This is fascinating. Taxonomies, safety classes. When will the first non-medical BCI be implanted? We all know that military use is of great interest. This is something that is not very transparent to us. And last thing is you can add 10 or 25 years, and that's why, again, to justify GESDA work, you will have a lot of things to think about. If those technologies become much more available, will regulation require cross-vendor interoperability to avoid vendor look-in for implants of BCI? To who the data generate belongs to train the model? This is also something very important, and you can see I will not go into detail. And to some extent, you could say for doping, for enhancement, who will own that? And I think this shows, and that's really, to summarize what GESDA is all about, is looking at the emerging technologies, and we believe that there is this acceleration now, and then bringing the diplomatic, as we call it, surrounding, and that's why we've engaged. And all this came out of several symposiums that GESDA did, and identify in this old neurotech BCI Then we went to the diplomatic forum to speak about things like neural rights and so on. And now we go to the third, to the funnel of translation. And we believe that after OQI, that could be another very interesting area initiative for GESDA to work on. And that, I hope that the panel will encourage us to do it, but now I leave it to the panel.
So thank you so much for the context setting. And it's really my delight to introduce these three remarkable panelists. I could say the rest of the discussion could be just on what their accolades are, but I will save us from that. First, we have Carolina Aguilar. She is the CEO and co-founder of INBRAIN Neuroelectronics, which is really a pioneering company building next-generation graphene-based neural interfaces. She brings over 2 decades of experience in healthcare and medtech, including leading deep brain stimulation for Medtronic. Then we have Vincent Borel. He serves on the board of directors of the Defitech Foundation, which has supported groundbreaking neurorehabilitation efforts like NeuroRestore and EPFL. He has roots in Logitech and a background in engineering, and he really bridges this world of consumer neurotechnology and also philanthropy. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have Anil Soni, who is the CEO of the WHO Foundation. He is a global health innovator who has spent 2 decades expanding access to care in low and middle income countries. He's been involved with the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. He's been involved in the Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Gates Foundation. So it's truly a pleasure to have all 3 of you here on this stage with us today. I'm going to actually start with you first, Carolina. You've just heard Patrick speak a lot about this pace of change in neurotechnology, and I'm sure from your perspective, leading innovation in this space, I want to know how close we are to seeing BCI scale. What do you think of this 5, 10, and 25-year landmarks, and what are the barriers that you're seeing to scale and to access?
Yeah, thank you so much. What I can say is that being in Medtronic, we talk about this company, was at the very early of modern neurotech. And it was actually a pioneer breakthrough, actually coming from Grenoble, from Europe, but with the help of this American company, around the 80s, and finally with the first approval on the 90s. So when we look at the first 30 years of where this development happened, and we look at what is happening now, the speed of innovation right now is quantic. It's really extremely fast. And I think what it's not that fast is all the process of developing and approved and reimbursed. However, I think there's also a lot of focus there because I think the brain is creating such a burden, like 1.7 trillion only with Parkinson and Alzheimer annually, that at some point also regulatory bodies are putting a lot of focus to actually help us resolve some of these issues going forward when it's about the speed and helping billions of people around the world with this neural burden. Mm-hmm. And you said regarding the barriers?
Yeah, what are some barriers that you're seeing to accessibility and scale in this space?
As I said, I think the speed of science and development is quite high, but there's still a process, a regulatory process, a reimbursement process that takes a lot and is fragmented, honestly. From the US perspective, for instance, we got FDA breakthrough designation, and there is a TAP program, which is a total product life cycle product, where actually we get access to FDA pretty much every month to resolve hurdles or questions that we have that need some feedback. They don't tell you what to do, but they give you feedback of where can you look further or what is not the way so you don't get lost, right? I think programs like that, and I hope that the European Union also aligns with that framework, helps a lot. Actually, Switzerland has this compatibility now with FDA that I think is going to help a lot. But I think the regulatory path is very important because you can get lost very quickly in endless discussions on clinical trials, setups, or even how do you set up AI frameworks and things like that. I think when it comes to equality or equitability here, I think that is actually dictated by the condition itself. I think that being a class 3 medical device, so an implantable medical device, there's enough oversight on the regulatory side as to make sure that this is equitable. So if Parkinson is equitable as a disease, we hope to see then on the other side of the therapy the same access, not only in gender, but also when it comes to probably cost, is where we will need to look further and make sure that these devices we have a good cost on delivery from our side, from the industry, and then how we could expand them in a way that we can sell them in every healthcare system, right? And in the past, it's been also a challenge, but I think in our case, we want to be paid in the future by outcomes and not by the system. So if we can actually deliver the benefit that is supposed to deliver, or even higher, and avoid complications and save money on the healthcare system, that maybe we get a bonus, but if not, that we could pay a penalty. So I think there's a lot of ways to actually ensure an equitable deployment around the world.
Yes. I guess, Vincent, I had a very similar question. So you've talked about regulations as a hurdle. What are some not regulations, what are some barriers or challenges perhaps that you see maybe even before regulations of that translating the basic sciences into market? I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, and then also kind of how Defitech has been handling those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think we look at the whole neurotech field, and what's interesting to see is we see kind of two valleys of death. There's one that goes from, we see a lot of amazing leading research that stays in the lab. So moving from lab to patient, first trials is very hard because you need to bring different teams, different institutions to work together. Typically research happens in an engineering school. How do you bring it to patients? It's different working on mice than working on humans. There's a lot of regulation, as you were talking about. And then there's the whole commercial aspect. Neurotech is not broadly available from a market standpoint, and so there's not as much money flowing in, right? I think seeing how Elon Musk has created and catalyzed so much attention is what he observed was to say, hey, there's all of those technologies available. They're actually all pretty mature, but there was not enough funds to bring all of them together so that you could take the electrodes, the PCIs, the AI capabilities, and you just need enough funds and enough of the cross-pollination to bring the system together. So I think those two are kind of the two main barriers that we see. When we think of our role as a nonprofit, we see that first step, that first gap that exists, there is no commercial incentive today, right, to do it. So how do you help essentially institutions and those leading research to make it to patients? And once you can show that there is a real application for humans and that it is working, commercial interest is growing. And we were talking about the acceleration. Patrick showed kind of how quickly it's accelerated over the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I think you were talking 1 or 2 patients being implanted. Just in the last year, I think it's blown in proportion. You're seeing, whether it's China or Neuralink, 5 years ago, they had 1 patient. By the end of this year, I think they're going to have 10 or 15. China has gone from 0 to 30 in 18 months. So we're still small in terms of numbers, but it's scaling really, really rapidly. What's interesting is I was thinking about this panel. I think if you go back, actually, and you were to compare aviation, right? Most people who came from abroad flew here. But if you go to the basics, actually both the initial impulse that led to either neurotech today or aviation were discovered in the 1700s, right? Now, if you think about where is neurotech relative to aviation, I think we're probably in the beginning of the 1900s, when the Wright brothers did the first flight. We're kind of there today. Now, how fast this is going to happen, because it only took 10 years for the first flights to happen and be more commercially available, and by the 60s, we had commercial aircrafts everywhere. I think we're at that pivotal moment.
Really interesting. I want to turn to you, Anil, and I'm kind of continuing on this thread of barriers and challenges, but also both panelists have already recommended kind of some steps that you can take. And I'm wondering, what are some concrete actions, given your role at the WHO Foundation and also, of course, the WHO, what are concrete actions we can take to start making things more equitable? What are some steps, whether that's modes of collaboration or hubs, what would be a good first step?
Sure. Well, let me start by just talking about what we mean by equity, particularly when we're talking about neurological conditions. And my starting point is always, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and in the evenings I have to go home and tell my 4-year-old what I did. And we read a book recently, I think it's called Little People, Big Dreamers, about innovators. And one of the books we read recently was about Stephen Hawking. And so I'm going to talk to my son about today through the lens of Stephen Hawking. And I know it's not formally a brain-computer interface because it was looking at facial activity, but machines allowed Stephen Hawking to be active and to have a voice and to write and to move. And where would astrophysics be without Stephen Hawking? And so when I think about equity, the question that just went through my head is, how many Stephen Hawkings do we have around the world who aren't realizing their potential as a consequence of those limitations? Now, neurological conditions are broad, but 3 billion people have them around the world. 70% are in low and middle income countries where there's virtually no access to any interventions at all. Less than 1 in 4 people have access. And on the African continent, there's not a single dollar in a single budget in health ministries for neurological care. So we are in a very inequitable moment. And part of the reason why, as Patrick shared, is that many of the technologies that have existed today are invasive. They're high cost. They require substantial infrastructure. They require specialized healthcare workers. What's very exciting is that many of the technologies now being developed, low cost, high impact, non-invasive. And by low cost, I just don't mean low price, because of course they will have a price linked to the benefit they bring in high income markets, but they're low COGS, meaning that they could be offered at a low price for markets where you need to offer it at a low price to have access. That's fundamentally what the World Health Organization is thinking about. So when you saw Patrick's graph where you see a rise in regulatory, normative standards engagement, that's what the World Health Organization does. And that benefits both low-income countries and high-income markets because it creates the conditions in the market for technologies to scale. People think of WHO focused on low-income countries. Africa, actually the flu vaccine every year, at least in the United States, and I think here in Europe, is determined by the WHO. So the WHO creating the normative framework for technologies to have a market, and then the guidance to countries to uptake those technologies, that's what will create greater equity. And the WHO has done that for other health conditions. And what the foundation does is raise the resources necessary for that regulatory and normative work so that we can make that move towards equity.
I saw you, Carolina, nodding your head a bit. Did you want to comment on anything, especially around the notion of cost? Because this is something that we also talked about in preparation for this. Is there anything that you see towards this point of affordability, but mostly from the technical side? Is there anything around materials and sustainability that also contribute to lowering costs and increasing access?
So I think there's 2 aspects here. So when it comes to high effective therapeutics, we still don't have much that is not implanted when it comes to brain-computer interfaces. I think we will come. But to get signals that can be decoded and turned into a therapy on the brain, and data is going to be therapy, and I will talk about it in a second, you need to be very close to where the neurons are communicating. That's why it became an implantable mission. I think maybe in 10, 20 years, we will be able to do the same without anything implanted, but so far, the best method, and that's why people like Elon Musk and others are putting billions into getting this right, it's going in that way. Now, in the past, to actually implant these devices, when we started in Grenoble, it was about an 8-hour surgery, 9-hour surgery, 10-hour surgery. Now it's a 2-hour surgery, and in the future will be 30-minute surgery or less, because that is, several technologies need to converge. we are at the era of robotics, but the era of micro-robotics is also starting. So when you put micro-robotics with advanced materials that can deliver tiny threads, the size of a combined ace of hairs in the brain, you can do things much more minimally invasive in less time, and therefore the cost of all that and the training that is required, because it's mainly automated, is much lower. So there is that part, and the other part that has been hard is actually program these devices. At the end, you have something in your body that is decoding, so reading and writing in real time to actually create a therapy. And if you take drugs, or if you do certain activities, and if it's a neurodegenerative disease, it deregulates. The therapy is actually progressing. You have to readjust these things. When you add materials like ours that has hundreds of thousands of contacts, you cannot do that manual programming anymore. It's been manual up to today. It's going to be agentic AI-driven from now on. And what in the past it would take 2 hours to adjust is going to take seconds to adjust. So I think that there's a part, which is the implantation, but also the management of these diseases, that are going to turn implants into electronic prescriptions. And the other part is that usually these patients, the 150,000 annually, stay on their expert center, and they were not going back to their referral neurologists or to their GPs, because these people were getting back all these implanted patients and they didn't know how to manage them. So they were also not sending more patients to get the therapy. So there was a backlog there. And I think that right now, because it's going to be very intuitive and like an electronic pill, these patients will go back to their initial GPs or neurologists, and it will be AI helping to manage that with the supervision of doctors. So doctors will be like control tower agents, actually looking at a much broader set of patients, and therefore increasing accessibility with a very reasonable cost and savings for the healthcare systems, because we will be able to save a lot of the comorbidities, long-term complications, visits to hospitals. So there's been a clear value, meaning outcomes that matter to patients divided by cost being generated.
And I know, Vincent, you've also talked about like how it matters for outcomes to patients. And I think I've heard from all of you now this looming thing of cost. So I guess, what role does philanthropy in general play in reducing these costs and also time to market? And in particular, I know that you've talked about it's kind of not just what role, but also when philanthropy plays a role. So I wonder if you can weigh in here.
Yeah, look, I talked about how there's so much amazing breakthrough technologies that are being developed, and the faster we can bring it to patients, I think the more chances we have to actually have technologies that are going to be less invasive. Because remember, if I put something in your brain, it's going to stay there, right? Unless you're staying in a lab and being observed. So if it stays for 10 years, or, Medtronic's been implanting, they stay there for a very long time. So you got to make sure that it's going to be stable. Now, your brain is very complex. So today, when we do things, if you do an implant, you're only getting signal from where you're getting the implant, right? Like if you're going deep into the brain. So you're being very precise, but you're also being very localized in what you're doing. And so I think we are at a point where probably we'll look at it in, 10, 50 years and go, gosh, we were like, if you really want to understand the brain, you would have to put pins everywhere in your brain. And by that point, you're probably butchering every neuron and there's not much left, right? So we need to have massive technology evolution so that we can bring it to a level where it's not as invasive, so not as limited in terms of if I have to go and do an 8-hour surgery in order to get the benefit, not many people will have access to it by definition. So we need to evolve the technology so that we can access the brain in a way that's going to be easier to apply it before I think we can make it more cost effective in reality. And we are at that very early stage of we're now able to understand the brain signals. So we've been actually getting brain signals for 100 years, right? We're only starting to understand them, and AI is really helping because brain signals are so complex. The beauty is we can train models to a point where they're not just specific to a patient, but you can actually apply it to many more patients. So already there, we're simplifying and making it more applicable to more people. So that's just one example of how technology is going to help to accelerate and lower the cost and access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to give the audience online and in the room just one example of a non-invasive technology. Patrick and I were talking about it earlier. There's a company called BrainQ. It has a device, a halo, which essentially bathes the brain in electromagnetic radiation, and that's substantially improved stroke recovery. So that's just one early example of a startup that is, to your point about Wright brothers to commercial flights, showing where we might go. Mm-hmm. And for technologies like this, to your question about philanthropy, I'm on the board of an organization called MedAccess, and that's a use of philanthropy effectively to create an analog of an advanced market commitment. So it goes to companies and say, you have a new technology, you'd like to sell it to a broader range, you want to get your costs down, we'll guarantee you a certain volume of procurement so that markets can access those products at a lower price that would otherwise only be possible after you reach a certain demand level. So that's an example both of a less invasive technology and of an application of philanthropy to accelerate access to technology.
I appreciate that. Since we're talking about history and the Wright brothers, obviously this is about anticipation and about evolution of technology, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from history, and we don't always have to, reinvent the wheel. So I'll come back to you here, Anil. What lessons can we learn from past global health initiatives? You've been involved in so many that we can kind of turn to when we're thinking about equity considerations. What insights perhaps from, you've already kind of talked about the WHO Brain Health Initiative. What can we learn from these past?
There's many examples of other technologies where you've had markets that have been successful or tech companies that have been successful in markets, high-income markets, the US, Europe, Japan, that now have wide access in low-income countries. And the one where I cut my teeth when I last lived in Geneva was the Global Fund in HIV. It's an oral solid pill, so on the one hand you think easy technology, but at the time, $10,000 per patient per year, now 30 to 40 in high-income countries, driven by innovation and also the marketing costs of these companies. But what we found was that when they licensed it out to other companies that could produce the same technology in a different location at a much lower cost, you could actually have a product that could be sold at high volume around the world. So now there's 30 million people on AIDS treatment versus 1 million 25 years ago. Most of that is in low-income countries, and that's benefiting the innovators. So I used to be at a company that sold more HIV medicines than any other company in the world. We had a royalty fee back to Gilead. So Gilead made a revenue from its out-licensing of that product to another company that could supply it at low cost, low margin to a large number of people. That basic model of how do you drive innovation in one place, but then how do you make that innovation available to another place in a way that is not cutting across the business, but actually enhancing the business. We have a lot of examples of that. And what I think is also exciting is now we're in a position where some of these technologies which need data to drive the AI, you could actually develop those in middle-income markets where you have large populations. So go work in India, go work in Kenya, with an academic medical center. That data will help you develop your technology so you don't have to wait until you're selling the product. You can actually implant. You can put the R&D or make sure that you're spreading the R&D into those very settings where you ultimately want to have benefit as well.
Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that's really struck me, this is my first GESDA summit, it struck me about almost every single panel I've seen, and also this one, is just this need to be collaborative, right? That's kind of the word of the 3 days. And to be multidisciplinary, cross-sector, you're just talking about this as well. I'm also a big proponent of this, but this is really hard to do in practice. So the question for all of you is, what are some best practices that you know of? What's one kind of takeaway that we can think about that makes this kind of really essential collaboration doable? Whoever wants to go first.
Wow, it's a big question. I always start from the company. We always talk internally about unreasonable teamwork, right? Because at the end, you are putting together electronics, mechanics, data science, clinical, quality, regulatory. So we need to make it happen, right? And then when you go outside into hospitals, I remember when we started Medtronic, we started talking to the neurosurgeons. And the neurosurgeons didn't have the patients, right? So the neurologists had the patients. So it's like, you guys need to talk together. Oh, but we are separated. And then the nurse said, hey, but I'm taking care of the patient, And then movement disorder units were built, actually, that were very collaborative, because otherwise, these people were completely isolated, and then patients actually were not properly being treated because everything was disconnected. I think everybody has experienced this in any disease areas, and we see it in practice that units of specialization are being always created. There's always a book by Michael Porter about redefining healthcare that talks about integrated practice units. Agencies have been, I think we see it in the everyday life. I think we better get used to it. So I think a best practice is just to highlight the benefits of doing that. What is the output of doing that versus just doing it alone? And make sure that focus is being put into that and reasonable collaboration.
Vincent, you want to weigh?
Yeah, look, we see it from the research standpoint, right? So we're looking at how do you bring research to patients, and just at that point, you need collaboration across institutions. So you're going to need an engineering school to work with a hospital so they have access to doctors and facilities. They're going to need, within engineering, they're going to need to work with different engineering fields across, including biologists and so on. So you got to bring all of those people with different backgrounds that don't speak the same language. It seems obvious, but they really don't speak the same language. They don't have the same approach in how they do work, to start bringing all of their knowledge together in order to bring it through. And that doesn't even cover the regulatory standpoint, which is, great, I have this great idea, I have this technology, I know it works, I've tested it on animals, and now I'm bringing it to patients. Guess what? There's a lot of red tape, so you don't just implant something in someone's brain, right? And that's a whole new layer of knowledge, which, by the way, is very new. So you also are kind of having to trailblaze your own path, because the regulatory bodies are like, we've never done this, how do we approach this, what is the right way of doing it? And so as you do those things, as the first ones kind of get through, I think there is then a new layer of collaboration that needs to happen, which is how do you start to build standards so that it becomes easier? The first one is very hard. The second one becomes easier. And that's why you're also seeing this inflection point, because now there's more and more reference to go to and to say, this company or this research has achieved it. We're going to use the same approach. People feel more comfortable, right? So the first time you trailblaze, it's scary for everyone involved. It takes a lot of courage. The second time you go, it feels a little more comfortable. And it needs to be kind of standardized across.
Yeah.
If I might add something that I have forgotten, you see China 17-step plan. When a strategy is aligned, you also align better on this unreasonable collaboration, on in collaboration. I think China is very successful because they've built dynasties. Strategy has been always on their agenda, and you see these long-term strategies that align people to collaborate. I think this is one on the bigger scale of the range, is a point that actually helps to align collaboration. Sorry for that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Patrick?
Yeah, good.
A very concrete example. Earlier this week, I was at the World Health Summit in Berlin, and we announced a new collaboration with Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly is one of a number of life science pharmaceutical companies that are investing long-term in products for neurological conditions, including dementia and within dementia, Alzheimer's. They do not have a product to sell yet, but they know that countries need plans, and they need global plans. There's a global initiative on dementia at the WHO, which needs to translate to national plans for scale-up. How do we address dementia, which is a growing problem in low and middle-income countries? How do we take advantage of new technologies, including some of the blood marker diagnostics that are now just coming to market? This is an example of a company that's working with the WHO and national governments to seed the soil for products that they want to bring to market. right? So it's not a one-to-one. They're not yet submitting a product for regulatory review, but they're recognizing that we need to create the normative environment in order for these products to have a market. So that's a very specific example, and we're trying to create more pooled funds to allow for that so WHO can play its role so that you can continue to see that graph show the normative and the regulatory frameworks and environment continuing to improve.
Well, this has been a really insightful panel, and before kind of closing out, I think I want to give the floor back to Dr. Aebischer.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd like, of course, to thank the panelists. I think it shows how important this field is, how fast it is developing, and probably also that there's a need for really collaboration, discussion, to frame it so as to make it accessible to people. And at GESDA, we've kind of decided to do, you say, what would GESDA do practically? Why are we engaging? I think there are three pillars that we would like to develop. One is what we call a coalition of willing. I think going back to this collaboration. So you've seen that there's companies that are, this is already a clinical practice in deep brain stimulation for those diseases, and we want to make them more accessible. But I think what Vincent said also is that now, the research is moving very fast in laboratories, both on developing, as we say, chip technology, large language models, and so on, that I personally think it's going to be faster than 10 to 20 years. I think I wouldn't be surprised that we would see those applications in a 5 years range. Now, not necessarily for Parkinson's disease. To get the same thing with Parkinson's disease, it will maybe take, but there will be rehabilitation, mood stimulation and those kind of things that doesn't need as precise information and so on. So we will see some of those. And some of those are fantastic, but also they have to be framed to some extent. As long as we speak about disease, everybody kind of agrees, and we know that this will go through regulation. When you go to consumer health, which is very much thinkable, then it's a bit of the Wild West. And I think that's where there is need for anticipation of new policy, and that's why we think that GESDA is very much the place to what we call the second, implement responsible innovation practices. Now, how you would do it is a thing you need, as a third thing, also social engagement, because that touches the heart of what we are as human beings. And I think, you can imagine about controlling some of the higher level qualities of humans and so on. So that's why this alliance is so important. So what we think is, and I think Vincent said very clearly, is, it's complicated to go from the laboratory to humans, especially if you go for implantable things and so on. You need big infrastructures and so on. And typically, it costs a lot of money, and it's too early for the companies, for the startups to really invest in. So there are a couple of exceptions. If you're a billionaire like Elon Musk, you can do it. But for the majority, it's hard for the startup to raise. That's why big foundations, we believe, have a critical role. To some extent, we're not as big at Defitech, but Defitech was a pioneering, and thanks to the Borel family, Daniel and Vincent, but also I'd like to acknowledge Nicolas Horaz, who helped me to design those slides. In a sense, it is very important. This is what Defitech did. It took one in spinal cord injury stimulation. It was published largely in Science, Nature, very visible, done here in Lausanne and Geneva. But I think it showed that it's this coalition, and they were able to do it because big foundations decided. So I think the foundations are critical to bring this to humans. And I think this is the desire to have all those foundations that have the means. You don't get your grants like you do it in your lab, but to get the humans, you're talking about more than 10 millions. So this is not accessible by the typical funding agency. That's why I think that foundation will be critical. It's going to be very important for those foundations to agree of how to make those things more accessible, but also to frame it so that we don't see things that probably our species is not prepared or even wouldn't like to see. So I think that's where we believe this is going to be. And I'm happy to say that not only Defitech, but the VIS Center, the Qatar Foundation, nice to have you on the WHO, OECD that participated in drafting guidelines. So all this needs to be brought together to really favor something that I think can be very useful to certainly to patients, but also to analyze how we're going to be. Are we ready to augment our species, memory, facilities, cognition, and so on? Because this is the next thing. And sometimes things take faster than it goes faster. So we hoped it will not go too fast so that we have the time to think about it from an ethical point of view and an accessible. And I think that's why it's so important. So we invite, as GESDA, all the foundations interested, the also funding agency, to come around, to sit around, and the citizens also, because we're talking about who we are. This is the future of our species. We never thought, as a neuroscientist, I never thought that we would be that fast already where we are. But when you think that this is becoming exponential, and with the access of AI, and maybe tomorrow even quantum, this will give something which is quite unique. And this is really the soul of GESDA, is to anticipate and come up and help the implementation of those exciting, but also, technologies that needs to be framed.
I don't think I could close it out any better than that, even if I tried. So I want to just say thank you so much to the speakers and the panelists today for your insights. Thanks to everybody here for your engagement. I hope that we've all learned that equity isn't some sort of byproduct of innovation. It's actually necessary for its success. And so with that, enjoy the rest of your summit, and thank you all so much.
Thank you.